Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us to celebrate the work and presence of U.S. Poet Laureate Ada Limón at Hendrix College through the generous support of the Hendrix Murphy Foundation. It is fitting that our first reading to be open to the public since 2020 is for someone whose poetry welcomes and engages all readers, from fellow poet to the person who thinks they don't much like poetry. That is, until they experience the lyricism of Ada Limón. She is the author of 6 books of poetry, including The Carrying, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Poetry. Her book, Bright Dead Things, was nominated for the National Book Award, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and the Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award. Her work has been supported by a Guggenheim Fellowship. She grew up in Sonoma, California, and now lives in Lexington, Kentucky, where she writes and teaches remotely and hosts the critically acclaimed podcast, The Slowdown. Her new book of poetry, The Hurting Kind, is out from Milkweed Editions, and you will be able to purchase a beautiful hardcover copy after this reading. In June of 2022, Librarian of Congress Dr. Carla Hayden appointed Ada Limón to be the 24th Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry, also known as the U.S. Poet Laureate. The position has existed as part of the Library of Congress for over 80 years and was named by an act of Congress. Ada, it has been a true gift to spend the last few weeks and many years prior, but especially the last few weeks, immersed in your work with my students and other members of the Hendrix community. Your poems transcend the personal and collective into a space that is as deeply intimate as it is political. I've seen the way your work has influenced the writing of young poets as well as my own, inspiring us to be more attentive to the natural world, the body, and that which we might have taken for granted in language, the words passing between us. Ada Limón's precise way of capturing that which makes us all human and lets us sing our own unique experience has moved us to be more empathetic in life and on the page, encouraged self-reflection about our relation to the current moment of living on our planet, and pushed us to be more engaged readers and writers, more in touch with our own, as Ada calls it, radical humanity. I am honored to introduce her and brimming with anticipation for everyone in this room to be as changed by her work as I have been. Please join me in welcoming Ada Limón.
Hello. Oh, you all look so lovely. It's so nice. You know, you sit in the front row and you can't even see people filing in, and this is so beautiful. Hello, welcome. Come on in. Find a seat. Thank you, Julia, for that beautiful introduction. It is such a pleasure to be here. I always talk about how I feel like Arkansas is an unsung state. And living in an unsung state of Kentucky, it's nice to be in another unsung state with people that get it, right? That we're the people that are like, no, it's beautiful, you know? Defending. So I really appreciate that, being here in this place. Also some marvelous trees. I'm gonna just talk about the trees here. I'm going to read some poems. What about that? Read some poems. And I know that some of the students here have got to spend some time with The Carrying, so I'm going to start with The Carrying. And then I'll move on to The Hurting Kind. I think my guess is it's probably going to be about 12 poems, but I don't know for sure. sometimes I have a number in my head, and today the universe has not given me a number, so we're just going to go with it. But I promise not to go over, and I promise to leave some time for questions. And either answers or me evading questions. One or the other will happen. I'm going to start with a poem. We were just talking about trees, so I'm going to start with a poem about trees. Ancestors. I've come here from the rocks, the bone-like chert, obsidian, lava rock. I've come here from the trees, chestnut, bay laurel, toyon, acacia, redwood, cedar, 1,000 oaks that bend with moss and old man's beard. I was born on a green couch on Carragher Road between the vineyards and the horse pasture. I don't remember what I first saw, the brick of light that unhinged me from the beginning. I don't remember my brother's face, my mother, my father. Later, I remember leaves, through car windows, through bedroom windows, through the classroom window, the way they shaded and patterned the ground. All that power from roots. Imagine you must survive without running. I've come from the lacing patterns of leaves. I do not know where else I belong. Thank you. I woke up thinking about my mother, and I have a confession, which is, I'm on the road quite a bit, and now, thank you to the Librarian of Congress, I'll be on the road a little bit more. And here I am in my mid-40s. I know I don't look it. And I still send my itinerary and flight plans to my mother. And she will say, "Have you landed yet?" And we have this text relationship, we're very close, and so, but it will be consistent, where she's like, "I haven't gotten your itinerary for tomorrow's travel." And so anyway, I was thinking about her, and how I think that's kind of wonderful. I love that. And this is a poem I want to read for her. The Raincoat. When the doctor suggested surgery and a brace for all my youngest years, my parents scrambled to take me to massage therapy, deep tissue work, osteopathy, and soon my crooked spine unspooled a bit. I could breathe again and move more in a body unclouded by pain. My mom would tell me to sing songs to her the whole 45-minute drive to Middle Two Rock Road and 45-minute back from physical therapy. She'd say that even my voice sounded unfettered by my spine afterward, so I sang and sang because I thought she liked it. I never asked her what she gave up to drive me or how her day was before this chore. Today, at her age, I was driving myself home from yet another spine appointment, singing along to some maudlin but solid song on the radio. And I saw a mom take her raincoat off and give it to her young daughter when a storm took over the afternoon. My God, I thought, my whole life I've been under her raincoat, thinking it was somehow a marvel that I never got wet. It's funny, someone on Twitter, I'm trying to retain my social media because the first thing that the Library of Congress said was like, "You're probably going to want to get off all social media." And I was like, "But I have a poetry community." And so I'm going to try to stay on there as long as possible. But I had someone had said that they liked the raincoat because they lived on Middle Two Rock Road, and I got so excited. I was like, yes, Middle Two Rock Road, it's a real road. This is a poem that we talked about earlier with some students, and I thought I would bring it into the world here. I haven't read this one in a while. The Vulture and the Body. On my way to the fertility clinic, I pass 5 dead animals. First, a raccoon with all 4 paws to the sky, like he's gonna catch whatever bullshit load falls on him next. Then, a grown coyote, his golden furred body soft against the white cement lip of the traffic barrier. Trickster no longer, an eye closed to what's coming. Close to the water tower that says, Florence, y'all, which means I'm near Cincinnati, but still in the bluegrass state, and close to my exit, I see 3 dead deer, all staggered but together. And I realize as I speed past in my death machine that they are a family. I say something to myself that's between a prayer and a curse. How dare we live on this earth? I want to tell my doctor how we all hold a duality in our minds, futures entirely different, footloose or forged. I want to tell him how lately it's enough to be reminded that my body is not just my body, but I'm made of old stars, and so is he. And that last Tuesday, I sat alone in the car by the post office and just was for a whole hour, no one knowing how to find me, until I got out, the sound of the car door shutting like a gun, and mailed letters, all of them saying, thank you. But in the clinic, the sonogram wand showing my follicles, he says, if I have any questions, and says, things are getting exciting. I want to say, but what about all the dead animals? And he goes quicksilver, and I'm left to pull my panties up like a big girl. Some days, there is a violent sister inside of me, and a red ladder that wants to go elsewhere. I drive home on the other side of the road going south now. The white coat has said I'm ready, and I watch as a vulture crosses over me, heading toward the carcasses I haven't properly mourned or even forgiven. What if, instead of carrying a child, I am supposed to carry grief? That great black scavenger flies parallel now, each of us speeding intently and driven toward what we've been taught to do with death. Thank you. When that first was published, it was published on the Virginia Quarterly Review, which is a wonderful magazine. And but they have hashtags underneath their poetry, so you can search them, which is kind of lovely if you're looking for a theme. But underneath that poem, it says hashtag infertility, hashtag roadkill. It's just kind of marvelous. Hashtag roadkill. I'm going to read this poem and then I'm going to tell you a little story about it. Dead stars. Out here, there's a bowing even the trees are doing. Winter's icy hand on the back of all of us, black bark, slick yellow leaves, a kind of stillness that feels so mute it's almost in another year. I am a hearth of spiders these days, a nest of trying. We point out the stars that make Orion as we take out the trash, the rolling containers, a song of suburban thunder. It's almost romantic as we adjust the waxy blue recycling bin until you say, man, we should really learn some new constellations. And it's true. We keep forgetting about Antlia, Centaurus, Draco, Lacerta, Hydra, Lyra, Lynx. But mostly we're forgetting we're dead stars too. My mouth is full of dust and I wish to reclaim the rising, to lean into the spotlight of streetlight with you toward what's larger within us toward how we were born. Look, we are not unspectacular things. We've come this far, survived this much. What would happen if we decided to survive more, to love harder? What if we stood up with our synapses and flesh and said no? No to the rising tides, stood for the many mute mouths of the sea, the land. What would happen if we used our bodies to bargain for the safety of others, for Earth? If we declared a clean night, if we stopped being terrified, if we launched our demands into the sky, made ourselves so big people could point to us with the arrows they make in their minds, rolling their trash bins out after all of this is over. Thank you. The story I want to tell you is that it sounds like a brag, and I'm just going to say that making it sound like a brag is better than making it sound like a humble brag. But I was at the White House on Friday, and I was in the back of the room because I didn't have to do anything, so I was in the back of the room. It was for a Hispanic Heritage Celebration, and the president and Dr. Biden were on stage, and suddenly Dr. Biden just started reading this poem. And she quoted the "Look, we are not unspectacular things." And she did that whole part, and I just looked at my husband and I started crying and was like, what is happening right now? So I wanted to share that with you. I thought, I actually do have an Arkansas poem in this book, and so I thought I would read this. It was a visit to Frank Stanford's grave, and it was right after C.D. Wright had died. The light, the living sea, for Adam and Michael. We're stopped in Subiaco to lay stones on stone at a fellow penner's grave, where we jaw, punch-drunk and car-sick, about being buried or burned up. I don't want to take up any more space, I tell the boys, both fathers now, who, shaped like trees, lean towards the earth. I imagine their old daughters leaving a slice of gas station moon pie, rye, a nickel-plated acorn, ladies picnicking in the shade of a pine, as immobile as the body's husk. Chemicals and maggots, sure, but also a place to grieve, a creek, a constellation of deaths to count on. These men know something I don't, that someone will grieve past their bones. Count on them to be there among the shaded trunks of pines like the stark bars of a generous cage. What if no one comes to the cliffside where my skin's ashes set sail? No mourning kin, no lost hitchhiker. But friends, it's lunchtime. And doesn't my mouth still work? My appetite, my forked tongue. I haven't read that poem in a while. It's kind of fun to read a poem you haven't read in a while. You're like, oh, not bad. I'm going to read this poem as it's Hispanic Heritage Month, and Hispanic Heritage half months. If you don't know, it starts on October 15th and ends on September 15th and ends on October 15th. So it's this strange half month of celebration. But I wanted to read this poem in honor of my father, but also in what it feels like sometimes to be in a place where you realized they're focused on representation and your work, and they have a generous spirit, and then the other places you arrive and you realize that it was actually more about a sort of tokenism and checking the box. And so I want to read this. The contract says we'd like the conversation to be bilingual. When you come, bring your brownness so we can be sure to please the funders. Will you check this box? We're applying for a grant. Do you have any poems that speak to troubled teens? Bilingual is best. Would you like to come to dinner with the patrons and sip Patron? Will you tell us the stories that make us uncomfortable, but not complicit? Don't read us the one where you were just like us, born to a greenhouse garden. Don't tell us how you picked tomatoes and ate them in the dirt, watching vultures pick apart another bird's bones on the road. Tell us the one about your father, stealing hubcaps after a colleague said that's what his kind did. Tell us how he came to the meeting wearing a poncho and tried to sell the man his hubcaps back. Don't mention your father was a teacher, speaks English, loves making beer, loved baseball. Tell us again about the poncho, the hubcaps, how he stole them, how he did the thing he was trying to prove he didn't do. That poem is a true story in which my father was working for a school district in California, and one of the administrators during a meeting said that he was scared to park his car in a particular area because the Mexicans there would steal his hubcaps. And then my father, being Mexican, went out and stole the man's hubcaps. And then he waited until the next meeting, and he dressed up in a sombrero and a poncho and tried to sell the man his hubcaps back. And he made such a good point and such a huge, really significant shift in the policies there, that when he retired or left from that school district into another one, a larger one, they gave him a engraved hubcap. From one father to the next, this is a poem for my stepfather from the book The Hurting Kind, which is the new one. A good story. Some days, dishes piled in the sink, books littering the coffee table, are harder than others. Today, my head is packed with cockroaches, dizziness, and everywhere it hurts. Venom in the jaw, behind the eyes, between the blades. Still, the dog is snoring on my right, the cat on my left. Outside, all those red buds are just getting good. I tell a friend, the body is so body, and she nods. I used to like the darkest stories, the bleak snippets someone would toss out about just how bad it could get. My stepfather told me a story about when he lived on the streets as a kid, how he'd some nights sleep under the grill at a fast food restaurant until both he and his buddy got fired. I used to like that story for some reason, something in me that believed in overcoming. But right now, all I want is a story about human kindness. The way once, when I couldn't stop crying because I was 15 and heartbroken, he came in and made me eat a small pizza he'd cut up in tiny bites until the tears stopped. Maybe I was just hungry, I said. And he nodded, holding out the last piece. I think about that a lot because he is someone that has taught me a lot about poetry, and he was homeless on the streets for a long time. And there's always that wonder of how people can maintain their kindness, their humanity, when everything seems like it's against them. I'm going to read a poem called Banished Wonders. The American linden sways nonplussed by the storm. A bounce here, a shimmy there, just shaking like music, left over from the night's end, wafting into the avenues before sleep. I remember once walking down Clinton Street and singing that line, returning, New York is cold, but I like where I'm living. There's music on Clinton Street all through the evening. And of course, there was music, though it was me and my incessant remembering. And here now, what does one even offer? Darling cockroaches of the highest order, hard under things of hard underworlds, I am utterly suspicious of advice. What is the world like out there? Are you singing in the tunnels? I should say nothing sometimes. I should say memory will leap from the mountain. Dearest purple spiderwort in the ditch's mud, how do you do it? Such bravery, such softness, even with all that name-calling and rage. No one wants to be the pretty thing all the time, but no one wants to be the weed. Alone in an Argentina cafe, I never felt like dancing. I screwed my face up so it said nothing and no one and never. Borges lost his sight over years, and yet sometimes it's best to be invisible. What is it to be seen the right way, as who you are? A flash of color, a blur in the crowd, something spectacular but untouchable. And now the world is gone. No more Buenos Aires or Santiago, no tango, no samba, no more pisco sour, sweet and sticky and piercing the head's stubborn brick. Mistral writes, we don't need all the things that used to give us pleasure. Still, some dense desire to sneak into the cities of the world again, a window to sit at Cafe Tortoni and refuse an invitation because I can. Now we endure time, this envenomed veil of extremes, loss and grief and reckoning. Mistral writes, I killed a woman in me, one I did not love. But I do not want to kill that longing woman in me. I love her. And I want her to go on longing until it drives her mad, that longing, until her desire is something like a blazing flower, a tree shaking off the torrents of rain as if it is simply making music. Thank you. I had a moment when I wanted to sort of revisit the old myths, the old stories that are no longer useful for us. And I think it's an important thing to do when you have some time to think about what someone's told you that you don't need anymore. And I grew up thinking that I was from a broken home. But in reality, I had two homes that were wonderful. But just because my biological parents no longer lived together, people would say, oh, I'm so sorry about the divorce in your broken home. So this was a poem that came to me out of that revisiting old unhelpful myths. Joint custody. Why did I never see it for what it was? Abundance. Two families, two different kitchen tables, two sets of rules, two creeks, two highways, two step-parents with their fish tanks or 8-tracks or cigarette smoke or expertise in recipes or reading skills. I cannot reverse it. The record scratched and stopped to that original chaotic track. But let me say, I was taken back and forth on Sundays. and it was not easy, but I was loved, each place. And so I have two brains now, two entirely different brains. The one that always misses where I'm not, and the one that is so relieved to finally be home. I'm just going to read 3 more poems, and then we'll have some questions and maybe some answers. I haven't read this poem in a while, and I think I will read this poem. There's sometimes, there's a category of poems. You could probably just call them X poems. And I can see you guys, you know what I'm talking about. You have written some of these. You might be writing one of these now. So this is an X poem that shows up in this book. Only the faintest blue. Somewhere in the haunted desert, I hitched my callow life to a man who thought I hadn't suffered enough. He might have said that very thing. You haven't suffered enough. Young whiptail lizards lined the cottonwood path to the river where I walked each day to remember who I was, she who had not suffered. My hands tanned in the sage green air. I walked until I was softer, until clouds, until I could tame my colors and go back and cook a lazy dinner. Once he insisted I ride home with a friend who was clearly drunk, so he could make a call he didn't want me to hear. An ex, a lawyer, a dealer, I don't know. I knew I didn't like his friend, who drove too fast after shots of tequila at the roadside Mexican dive with fake spiky cacti in the foyer, like stage props. Maybe this is suffering, I thought. Am I suffering now? Or now? I felt most myself by the river. Vast sorrel river ready to flood or tear down everything in its way, hard to cross, rapid and legendary, the color of the earth. I did not want to throw myself in. Instead, I'd watch the whiptails skitter in dust, sisters of the small, quiet pleasure of edges, and disappearing to safety. I can still hear that river in my mind. My teacher can still remember the day I left him, the arguing, the fight where I kept my head down and packed like fury was a new, smart skill. But mostly, I remember the flitting of lizards, how they felt like kinship, how later I read that the New Mexico whiptail is an all-female species, reproducing by parthenogenesis, asexual and yet genetically diverse. Yellow lines run the length of their gray bodies with vibrant blue-green tails when they're young. And as they age, their scales, their whole body changes until only the faintest blue remains. And safer now, they become the earthen color of the river. Thank you. I haven't read that one in a while. It was nice to read. Read this poem for my father. My father's mustache. Let us pause to applaud. See those plosives. Isn't that a good word? Plosives? That makes the mic do that thing. It was my fault. I had a big plosive there. My father's mustache. Let us pause to applaud the white bell-bottom suit, the white flared collar, the black, thick, coiffed hair in this photo that my father has sent of himself at a gathering off Sonoma Highway in the early 70s. I can't stop looking at the photo. There is a swagger that feels almost otherworldly, epic, like Lorca expounding in Buenos Aires, not the form, but the marrow of form. He is perfect there, my father in the photo. I feel somehow as if I'm perched on a bay laurel, nearby, though not born yet. It is in black and white, the photo. You can see his grin behind his lush mustache. Is it time that moves in me now? A sense of ache and unraveling. My father in his pristine white suit, the eye of the world barely able to handle his smooth, unbroken stride. It's been a year since I've seen him in person. I miss how he points to his apple trees. I miss his smooth face that no longer has the mustache I always adored. As a child, I once cried when he shaved it. Even then, I was too attached to this life. And I'll just say that my father joined me in DC for my inaugural reading, and let me tell you, he grew his mustache back for me. And I tell you this because if you think poetry can't do anything, and he looked amazing. All right, I'm going to just read one last poem and then we'll have some questions. This is a poem that I wrote during the very first months of the pandemic. It was probably March 2020, maybe, yeah, I think it was that month. And I was getting phone calls. It's a weird thing when you're a poet where people will call you and say like, do you have any comments about the pandemic? And you're like, no, I'm a poet. Like, I don't have any comments. I don't know what to tell you. But the hardest thing for me was, of course, fear. I think that you can write out of rage, and I think you can write out of sadness, and I think you can write out of heartbreak and trauma, but it's really hard to write out of fear and anxiety. And that, at least for me. And so I kept thinking about trying to write a poem, and then I kept playing it out in my head, and I kept thinking, well, that subject, I've written about that before, and that one I've written about, like I can't do that. It's not enough. And then, of course, in my despair of not being able to find a subject for poetry, I wrote a poem. The End of Poetry. Enough of osseous and chickadee and sunflower and snowshoes, maple and seeds, samara and shoot. Enough chiaroscuro, enough thus and prophecy, and the stoic farmer and faith in our Father and 'tis of thee. Enough of bosom and bud, skin and God not forgetting, and star bodies and frozen birds. Enough of the will to go on, or not go on, or how a certain light does a certain thing. Enough of the kneeling and the rising and the looking inward and looking up. Enough of the gun, the drama, and the acquaintance's suicide, the long-lost letter on the dresser. Enough of the longing and the ego and the obliteration of ego. Enough of the mother and the child and the father and the child. And enough of the pointing to the world, weary and desperate. Enough of the brutal and the border. Enough of can you see me? Can you hear me? Enough I am human. Enough I am alone and I am desperate. Enough of the animal saving me. Enough of the high water. Enough sorrow. Enough of the air and its ease. I am asking you to touch me. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you. What a beautiful crowd. Thank you so much for being here. If you want to ask a question, I'm happy to listen to you ask a question. And maybe evade it, and maybe answer it. But I'm happy to do so. I've stunned you all to silence. Oh, green. Yeah. Yeah.
We have microphones set up over here and one on that side. So if you want to ask a question, please come.
Yeah, just to make it more intimidating.
What's the song you've been listening to recently?
Oh. There's so many songs. I'm trying to think of one that I've been playing on like repeat. It might be funny, but it's Shaka Khan, and it's "Tell Me Something Good." Tell me that you love me, yeah. Every time I'm in the mood for like a little shake-up, it's Shaka Khan. See, that wasn't so hard. Yeah.
Nobody rushes to the mics. What's a poet you've been reading recently?
Oh, yeah. God, I've been listening to so many poets. But I just got the new Tara Betts, which is wonderful. I think Jake Skeets is writing some amazing poems right now. I've just seen some of the new work that's coming out. Christopher Soto has a new book that's fantastic. Those are a few, but yeah.
And what poets inspired you when you were growing up, like turning into
Yeah,
learning
you
your
know,
style?
there was a great, when I was growing up, there was a great show that was on, it was PBS, it was like The Power of Words, and it was hosted by Bill Moyers. And it was a lot of the poets that I loved, and they all were reading at the Dodge Poetry Festival, and then he would do interviews with them. And it was Phil Levine and Sharon Olds, and one of my favorites was Lucille Clifton. And I only got to see her read once in person, but her work has changed my life. So has Phil Levine's, and so has Sharon Olds. But those were a few that really kind of sparked my interest, and those moments. My brother borrowed those tapes from the library, which I still think, my older brother was like, "Hey, you might like these," and I was probably, 10 or something, and on VHS. And I remember thinking, I watched Lucille Clifton read a poem, and I went into my room and thought I would try it. And I remember being like, "This poem is terrible." And I was like, poetry might be hard. Yeah. There we go.
I want to ask, as a woman of Latin heritage, how have you addressed your own background with the responsibility that comes with being named U.S. Poet Laureate?
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, I think it's very, it's complicated in a lot of ways. I'll say that, with being named by the Library of Congress, there was this first part of me that was like, well, I've literally never even had a university job because I'm not that great with institutions. And now here I am. But I think that one of the things that has kept me and fueled me was the Poets Laureate that came before me and did such a marvelous job. I'm thinking about Joy Harjo. I'm thinking about Natasha Trethewey, Tracy K. Smith, Juan Felipe Herrera, and doing that in really difficult administrations, and believing that the power of poetry and the power of language and the power to connect with the arts and how that can bring us to a new level each time. I thought, there's no way I'm going to turn this down, because to turn that down would be to turn my back on them. And so this was like a moment that was not only about me, but about a continuation of a legacy and also the honoring of my ancestors. I think that my grandfather crossed the border and he lived in a chicken coop. You know, he lived in a chicken coop. And I think about him all the time, and I think if he didn't think that I would get up here and find some pleasure in this power, like what he would call a platform, right? He would say, oh, you've got to do it, you have to do it, but you have to do it for the good, right? And so I believe so much in the power of poetry. There's no other single thing that I could like speak out and feel adamantly in connection to than poetry, except for maybe love. Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to thank you for that response, especially in naming your grandfather.
Oh, I didn't hear that last part.
Yes, I'd like to thank you for that response, especially in naming your grandfather.
Thank you.
That is something that I find much relatable.
Thank you. Yes, Francisco Carlos Limón was a wonderful man, and this heart that I'm wearing right now is for him. Yeah, heart on fire.
I feel like every poet I've ever run into defines poetry in a very slightly different way. How do you feel when you define poetry?
Yeah. You know, I think that for me, the thing about poetry is that it actually resists definition. And that's what I love about it. Like when I signed up for poetry, I signed up for limitlessness. And I think that that's what's fun. Like someone can show me a poem and I could think for a second, is that a poem? And then I'm like, yeah, that's a poem. You know, you might show me a bunch of acorns, you know, mixed in with some sand and be like, this is a visual poem I made. And I would say, yes, that is a poem. I don't know what a poem is, but I know that if we keep making things that connect and communicate to each other and to the universe, we will be better for it.
What creation of yours are you most proud of?
Oh. What creation of mine am I most proud of? My relationships, my loves, my friendships, my family. That's what I'm most proud of. Those take work and their creation. So yeah, that's what I'm most proud of.
Was there a specific moment where you realized that poetry is what you want to engage in and write and create, or has it always been something you've had a fondness for?
No, I love that. There was a specific moment. It was like most of us, it was more like a sort of building, right? You know, but I do remember the moment when I was a theater major and I thought that's what I wanted to do, and I had to take some electives because they were like, you've taken every elective in performing arts, and you need to go elsewhere. And so I took these poetry classes, and I remember for the very first poetry course. And I was, you know, with theater, you're speaking someone else's words. And, you know, at that moment, it was almost all dead white men's words. And I was blown away that I could do this, that I was allowed to do this. And I wasn't asking anyone's permission. It didn't require a director to say I got the part. It didn't require anyone to say, okay, we've got, you know, the lights and the mic on. It just required me alone in my room making something. And for as much as I love community and I love making things in tandem with other people, I thought, oh my God, I can do this art all by myself. And that was like, it just felt like freedom. Everything clicked into place for me.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I think that poems that, in terms of poems that have brought me fear or that I'm scared to write, there's a couple different answers to that. One of them is that I never want to hurt anyone. And so sometimes if I'm exploring my own harm and trying to figure out how to do that without maybe really hurting another person, that's very difficult, I think, for me. And then I think there's also moments where I'm just trying to explore a new truth and something comes out and I'm like, oh, I did not know I felt that way. I think there's those moments like in the carrying with the moments about infertility that were the poems that were like, hey, maybe I don't want to have a kid. I think those are really scary because I had to admit that there was another option and that outcome might actually even be the preferred outcome. But I wasn't ready to let that go because I thought my narrative was leading to a child. And when you're in that middle of unknowing, it's hard to admit that maybe being child-free could be exactly what the universe asked of me. And maybe that means I could do some of the work that I'm meant to do in a different way. And that was scary. Yeah, thank you. Before you ask your question, I just want to honor anyone who is not able to walk up to the front and might need to ask a question from where they are. As someone who is often immobile, I just want to, okay, I just wanted to make that, because there are times where I'm like, well, I can't do that, so, yeah.
I just wanted to let you know that I do not have any tattoos, but your poems and Nikki Finney's poems are top contenders.
Oh, thank you. I do not have any tattoos either. Oh, thank you, Julia. Thank you for doing that in case someone wants to get up. Thank you.
I don't really think I need this. But my question was, what would you say is probably your biggest inspiration when you're writing your poetry? Because I know you write a lot about like your family, especially in the caring. You write a lot about nature. What would you say is like your biggest inspiration for your poetry?
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for walking the mic back there. I feel like maybe the inspiration changes from day to day, as inspiration does. But I think that for the most part, I'm always interested in what it is to be a human being alive and a human being that knows that they will at one point not be alive. And to say mortality is a driver of poetry seems obvious, but I do think that I am very interested in what it is to be aware of one's end and of all of our ends, and in doing so, feel the urgency of life. I think that in and of itself is my biggest inspiration. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
You look beautiful, by the way.
Thank you.
What advice do you have to up-and-coming poets that want to write about really difficult situations in their life but can't find the words?
Yeah. I think it's really important for young poets and new poets at any age. I think it's really important to remember that if you do have a hard subject that you want to tackle, and you will have teachers that will probably say, like, you should talk about this big thing, and maybe that's the thing that even brought you to the page. But I think it's really important that we implement a harm reduction model with creative writing, and so that we know that if you're writing about something that's a big ticket subject in your life, that you have a support system around you, so that if you're going to go down into the well, that you've got a ladder out. And I say that because I think it's really irresponsible sometimes for any of us that teach creative writing to be like, hey, write about the hardest thing that ever happened to you. Because I think in reality, sometimes we do need to write about that, but we may need to come at it from a different angle. We may need to come at it very softly, very gently, and not in that direct, overt way that people may expect of us. So I think it's really important that we protect ourselves in the making of those hard poems. because like Lamarad Owen says, the goal is longevity, right? Like we have to make sure that we're in this for the long haul. We don't want you to write one brilliant poem about the most traumatic thing in your life and then never write again because you never recovered from writing that poem, right? So having those ways of writing the poem, you know, maybe part of a poem or part of something and then recovering from it is really important. Yeah.
Right.
Hi.
This is sort of related to that. I personally have never written a poem before, at least not in my recent memory. And I figured this is kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to ask the National Poet Laureate,
Yeah.
you know, how one would decide to write a poem,
Yeah.
how one would arrive on that topic to first start that journey with. I guess,
Yeah.
again, that project. And you sort of answered that by elaborating on not wanting to dive right in
Yeah.
to the worst possible thing.
Yeah, don't do that.
Yeah, for someone with as much experience as you have, where would you begin, I guess, if you were, you know, looking back on whatever poems you wrote?
Yeah, that's beautiful. I really appreciate that, and I hope you write a poem, maybe even tonight. I think one of the things that I said this before to a craft talk, so forgive me if you heard this, but I do think that when we talk about writer's block or when we think about things that prevent us from writing, one of the big things is that it's not that we don't have anything to say, it's that we have too much to say. And so most of what's keeping us from the page is that it's too much, that we are overwhelmed, that we could start anywhere. There's a million ways in. And so what I always tell is, like, could you start a poem literally just looking at an object on your desk, an object that you have in your pocket, and just describe it? Tell us anything about it, and then ask questions of it. Why do I carry you around? Why are you on my desk? Why have you come from my dorm room to my first apartment to my home? And literally just look at it and ask questions of it and describe it until that object has its whole life. And that's how poems get written. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, sort of on that note, I was going to ask if you ever get writer's block, and if so, what remedies you use?
Yeah. So I mean, I will say, like I said, I don't really believe in writer's block because I do think it's because it's that we have too much to say. But I do think there are times where it's okay not to write. And I also have the benefit of, if I don't feel like writing, I just won't do it. But I don't have, you know, a class deadline or something. So, and the nice thing about writing poems is that there's actually not people that are like clamoring down your door to like get your next poem. So I think that for me, there are times when actually there's a difference between sometimes not wanting to write and just wanting to receive the world and listen to the world and read and be quiet and just absorb. And that's just as equally as important as putting something out into the world. Because I think oftentimes we think that in order to call ourselves a writer or an artist, we have to be producing, right? And that's sort of the American capitalistic model of production. And I feel like sometimes we have to pull the arts out of that. We have to extract it out of that. Because I think there are times where I haven't written for 6 months and I know that I'm still a poet. And what I'm doing is I'm reading and I'm loving and I'm feeding the dog and I'm living my life. And so that's really important to me, is to actually, if I don't feel like writing, not to write. But then I also feel like if I do feel like writing, but I can't find my way in, one of the things that I can literally sit down at any moment and say, I'll say, you know, I can just ask myself, what's happening right now? Like, where am I right now? And I'll start in the present moment, because for me, the past and the future are always moving through me at the same time. So if I am right here and we start talking and I can describe this, I can also be like, oh my God, I remember the play that I was in when I was in 2nd grade and there was an audience. You know, you can do that. And so I think just enticing the present moment, being very present, breathing, paying close attention to where you are, something new will come. Yeah.
So we talked in class about, I believe it was an interview today, but I found out on
Yeah, that's beautiful. I keep writing, but I do think it's a caretaking thing. Like if I can't, you can't. You know, I do think writing can help us heal, and I think it can help us live. I know it helps me live. I know reading helps me live. But we can't necessarily always write ourselves out of our world, right? And so there are times where you write it down, and instead of being sort of a healing, it's more like a resurrection of that wound. And I think those are the times where you have to be like, okay, this is something I can accept, that this is here, this is present, it's with me. And until the body is ready to lay it down, it's just, I'm gonna have to carry it. And we're all living with those things, you know, and to know that you're not alone living with those things, and to be able to maybe read other people's poems that are living with those things. I think that at least allows for some ease, because then you feel like, oh right, I'm not the only one, you know, hefting this bag of rocks, going like, all right, oh, how was your day? Fine, you know. You're not alone. Yeah, thank you. Oh yes, thank you. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, I appreciate it.